Lily was a bright and curious 7-year-old girl. Every day after school, she walked home along the same path, passing rows of houses in her quiet neighborhood. She loved looking at the different houses. Some had pretty gardens, others had playful dogs barking at the fence. But there was one house that always caught her attention. It was an old, lonely house at the end of the street. The windows were dusty, and the front yard was covered in dry leaves. The paint on the door was peeling, and the mailbox looked like no one had checked it for weeks. The house looked abandoned, but Lily's mother had once told her that an old woman named Mrs. Thompson lived there. She used to be very friendly, Lily's mother had said, but after her husband passed away, she stopped coming outside. I think she doesn't have any family left. Lily had never seen Mrs. Thompson, but something about the house made her feel sad. It looked like it needed someone to take care of it, just like an old toy left behind. One chilly afternoon, as Lily walked past the house, she slowed down. The sun was setting, and the sky was turning orange and pink. She stopped in front of the rusty gate, peeking at the dark windows. Was Mrs. Thompson really inside? Was she all alone? A feeling tugged at Lily's heart. She took a deep breath and made a decision. She was going to knock on the door. She pushed open the squeaky gate and stepped onto the old wooden porch. The boards creaked under her small feet. For a moment, she hesitated. What if Mrs. Thompson didn't want to be disturbed? What if she got angry? But then she remembered how lonely the house looked, and she gathered her courage. Knock, knock, knock. Lily knocked gently on the door and waited. Nothing happened. She knocked again, a little louder this time. Knock, knock, knock. Still, there was no answer. Maybe no one was home. Maybe her mother was wrong, and Mrs. Thompson had moved away. Disappointed, Lily turned to leave. But just as she stepped off the porch, she heard a soft noise from inside. A slow, shuffling sound, like someone moving very carefully. Then a weak voice called out, "Who is it?" Lily's heart jumped. Someone was inside. She hurried back to the door and stood on her tiptoes to speak through the small gap. "It's me, Lily. I live down the street," she said. There was a long silence. Lily wasn't sure if Mrs. Thompson had heard her. Maybe she should leave now. But just as she turned again, the door creaked open, just a tiny bit. Through the small gap, Lily saw a pair of tired, sunken eyes staring at her. The face behind the door was wrinkled and pale, with thin white hair falling over her forehead. The old woman looked surprised, as if she hadn't seen another person in a very long time. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Mrs. Thompson blinked at the little girl in front of her, as if trying to remember who she was. Lily swallowed nervously. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Mrs. Thompson didn't answer right away. Instead, she sighed, and her shoulders slumped. She looked exhausted, as if even standing at the door was difficult. Lily's eyes widened. Something didn't feel right. The way Mrs. Thompson looked, it was as if she hadn't eaten in days. Her hands trembled slightly, and she clutched the doorframe for support. Lily suddenly felt a lump in her throat. She had expected to meet a nice old lady, maybe someone who would smile and talk to her. But this woman looked weak and alone. A wave of sadness filled Lily's chest. I'll come back," Lily said quickly. She wasn't sure what to do, but she knew she couldn't just walk away. She needed to tell her mom. Mrs. Thompson opened her mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. She just gave a small, tired nod before slowly closing the door. Lily ran all the way home, her heart pounding. She had only knocked on the door out of curiosity. But now she felt something bigger, something more important. Mrs. Thompson needed help, and Lily was going to do something about it. Lily ran home as fast as she could, her little heart beating quickly. She burst through the front door, breathing heavily. "Mom, Mom," she called out. Her mother, who was busy in the kitchen, turned around with a worried look. "Lily, what's wrong?" she asked, wiping her hands on a towel. Lily's face was serious. "I knocked on Mrs. Thompson's door," she said, still catching her breath. Her mother's eyebrows raised in surprise. "You did?" Lily nodded quickly. She answered, "Mom, she looks sick and sad. Her house is dark and messy. She didn't even open the door all the way. I think she needs help." Her mother frowned and set down the bowl she was holding. She wiped her hands again, this time more slowly. "Are you sure, sweetie?" "Yes." She could barely stand. She didn't even say much. She just looked at me like she didn't know what to do. Lily's voice was full of concern. Her mother's expression softened, and she bent down to Lily's level. "That poor woman," she said quietly. "I haven't seen her in a long time. People used to visit her, but I guess they stopped." Lily tugged at her mother's sleeve. "We have to do something." Her mother nodded. "You're right. We can't just ignore this." Without wasting time, her mother went to the kitchen and started gathering some food. She packed a small basket with bread, soup, and a bottle of water. Then she grabbed a warm blanket from the couch. "Come on," she said. "Let's go check on her together." Lily felt a mix of nervousness and excitement as they walked back to Mrs. Thompson's house. It was getting darker outside, and the streetlights were just starting to turn on. The house still looked lonely, but this time, Lily didn't feel scared. She felt determined. Her mother knocked gently on the door. "Mrs. Thompson." "It's me, Anna, from down the street. My daughter Lily was here earlier." There was a long silence. Then the same weak voice came from inside. "Anna." "Yes," Lily's mother said kindly. "We brought you some food. May we come in?" There was another pause, then the slow sound of shuffling feet. The door creaked open again, just a little more than before. Mrs. Thompson's face was now fully visible in the dim light. Her eyes widened when she saw Lily standing next to her mother. For a moment, she didn't say anything. "We don't want to bother you," Lily's mother continued. "We just want to make sure you're okay." Mrs. Thompson's lips trembled as she looked down at the basket in Anna's hands. Her eyes filled with emotion, and she let out a small, shaky breath. Finally, she stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in," she whispered. Lily and her mother exchanged a quick glance before stepping inside. The house was cold and smelled dusty. The furniture was covered in old blankets, and there were piles of newspapers in the corners. A single chair sat near a small table with an empty teacup on it. Mrs. Thompson slowly lowered herself into the chair, looking exhausted from just those few movements. Lily's mother set the basket down on the table and took out the warm soup. "When was the last time you had a good meal?" she asked gently. Mrs. Thompson shook her head. "I don't remember," she admitted. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Lily watched as her mother poured the soup into a bowl and placed a spoon in Mrs. Thompson's shaky hands. The old woman looked at it for a moment, then took a slow sip. Her eyes closed as if she hadn't tasted something warm in a long time. Lily felt a lump in her throat. She had never seen someone look so grateful for something so small. "We'll help you," her mother said softly. "You don't have to be alone." Mrs. Thompson looked at them, her eyes now wet with tears. She didn't say anything, but she nodded. At that moment, Lily knew they had done the right thing. And deep down, she felt that this was just the beginning. As Mrs. Thompson took small sips of the warm soup, Lily looked around the house. The dim light from a single lamp cast shadows on the walls. Everything looked old and untouched, like time had stopped inside this house. Dust covered the furniture, and cobwebs hung in the corners of the ceiling. Lily's eyes moved to the kitchen. The sink was full of unwashed dishes, and the counter was cluttered with empty food cans. She saw a small fridge, and when she peeked inside, her heart sank. There was almost nothing, just a half-empty bottle of milk, a few old slices of bread, and a tiny piece of cheese. "Mom," Lily whispered, tugging at her mother's sleeve. Her mother followed her gaze, and a deep sadness filled her eyes. She turned back to Mrs. Thompson. "How long have you been living like this?" she asked gently. Mrs. Thompson placed the empty bowl down and sighed. "I don't know," she said softly. "I stopped counting the days." Lily's chest felt tight. She couldn't imagine what it was like to be alone in a house like this, with no food, no warmth, and no one to talk to. "Why didn't you ask for help?" Lily asked, her voice small. The old woman gave a weak smile. "I didn't want to bother anyone," she said. "People have their own lives. I thought, maybe they forgot about me." Lily felt tears sting her eyes. No one should feel forgotten. Her mother reached for Mrs. Thompson's hand. "You are not a bother," she said firmly, "and you are not forgotten. We are here now." Mrs. Thompson blinked as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her lips trembled, and she quickly wiped her eyes. "You are too kind," she whispered. Lily suddenly had an idea. She turned to her mother. "Can we clean up a little? Maybe we can make things better for her." Her mother smiled and nodded. "That's a great idea." At first, Mrs. Thompson protested. "Oh no, I can't ask you to do that." But Lily shook her head. "You didn't ask. We want to." Slowly, Mrs. Thompson gave a small nod of approval. Lily and her mother got to work. Lily started by picking up the newspapers and trash from the floor, while her mother washed the dishes in the sink. Mrs. Thompson watched them, her eyes filled with emotion. Lily didn't mind cleaning. She hummed a little tune as she picked up things, making it feel like a fun game. She wiped down a small wooden table near the window and placed a clean cloth over it. When she was done, it already looked much better. Her mother swept the floor, clearing away the dust and dirt. Then she took out the warm blanket she had brought and gently wrapped it around Mrs. Thompson's shoulders. "Better?" her mother asked. Mrs. Thompson clutched the blanket and nodded. "Much better," she said softly. Lily beamed. The house still needed a lot of work, but at least Mrs. Thompson looked a little happier now. Her mother packed up the empty bowl and smiled. "We'll be back tomorrow with more food," she promised. Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened. "Tomorrow?" "Of course," Lily said. "We can't leave you alone like this." For a moment, Mrs. Thompson didn't speak. Then she gave them the smallest yet warmest smile Lily had ever seen. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for knocking on my door." Lily squeezed her hand gently. As they left the house, Lily felt lighter, as if she had done something truly important. She looked up at her mother. "We'll help her get better, right?" Her mother placed a hand on Lily's shoulder. "Yes, sweetie, we will." Lily smiled. She knew this was just the beginning. That night, Lily couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Thompson. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling a heavy weight in her chest. The image of the old woman sitting alone in that cold, dusty house made her eyes water. How long had she been living like that? How could no one have noticed? The next morning, Lily woke up with a new sense of determination. She ran downstairs, where her mother was making breakfast. "Mom, we have to do more," she said urgently. Her mother turned around, setting a plate of toast on the table. "We will, sweetheart. We'll bring her more food today." Lily shook her head. "Not just us. Everyone needs to help. She has no family. She needs more than just food. She needs people." Her mother looked at her thoughtfully. Then she smiled. "You're right, Lily." After breakfast, they packed a new basket with fresh food. Warm soup, sandwiches, fruit, and some cookies Lily had helped bake. But before heading to Mrs. Thompson's house, they made another stop. Lily knocked on the door of her neighbor, Mrs. Carter. She was an elderly woman too, but unlike Mrs. Thompson, she was always outside, tending to her garden or chatting with neighbors. She was kind and always had time to talk to Lily. When Mrs. Carter opened the door, she smiled. "Well, hello, Lily. What brings you here so early?" Lily took a deep breath. "Mrs. Carter, do you remember Mrs. Thompson?" The smile faded from Mrs. Carter's face. Oh dear, yes. I haven't seen her in a long time. She's not doing well, Lily explained. Her house is messy, and she has almost no food. She's all alone. My mom and I are helping her, but we need more people. Mrs. Carter's eyes filled with concern. That poor woman, she said softly. I thought maybe she moved away. I didn't realize she was still there. Lily's mother stepped forward. We were thinking, maybe the neighborhood could come together and help her out. She needs food, warmth, and company. Mrs. Carter nodded firmly. I'll do whatever I can. I can cook some meals and visit her, and I know some others who would be willing to help too. Lily grinned. Thank you, Mrs. Carter. Feeling hopeful, they went to the next house, and then the next. Some people were surprised. They hadn't even noticed Mrs. Thompson was still living there. Others felt guilty, realizing they had been too busy to check in on their elderly neighbor. But one by one, they all agreed to help. By the time Lily and her mother reached Mrs. Thompson's house, they had a small group of neighbors ready to support her. Some brought food, others offered to help clean, and a few said they would visit regularly to keep her company. When Lily knocked on the door, it took a while before Mrs. Thompson answered. She looked surprised to see so many people outside her house. What is all this? She asked, her voice trembling. Lily smiled up at her. It's help, she said simply. Mrs. Carter stepped forward. We should have come sooner, dear. We won't let you be alone anymore. Mrs. Thompson's lips parted in shock. Her eyes glistened with tears as she looked at the warm, smiling faces around her. For so long, she had believed she was forgotten. But now, standing before her was proof that she wasn't. A single tear slipped down her cheek. Thank you, she whispered. Lily reached out and held her hand. You don't have to thank us, she said gently. You're our neighbor, and neighbors take care of each other. As the group stepped inside to start helping, Lily felt a warmth in her heart. This was bigger than just bringing food. It was about bringing back love, care, and kindness to someone who had been alone for too long. And she knew, from that day forward, Mrs. Thompson would never feel forgotten again. Mrs. Thompson wiped her eyes as the neighbors stepped inside her house. She looked around at the familiar faces, people she had once known, people she had spoken to long ago. Now, they were here, standing in her home, offering their help. It didn't feel real. Lily squeezed her hand. Don't worry, Mrs. Thompson. We're going to make things better. Mrs. Carter, the kind elderly neighbor, placed a gentle hand on Mrs. Thompson's shoulder. You've been alone for too long, dear. It's time to change that. Mrs. Thompson gave a small nod. She was still overwhelmed, but there was something else in her eyes now. Hope, cleaning and caring. The neighbors wasted no time. Some began cleaning the house, sweeping the dusty floors and wiping the windows. Others cleared out the old newspapers and empty cans that had piled up over time. The air inside the house began to change. It no longer felt lonely and cold. Lily helped by dusting the small table near the window. As she worked, she noticed a picture frame hidden under a pile of books. She picked it up carefully and saw an old photograph of a young woman and a smiling man standing beside her. She turned to Mrs. Thompson. Is this you? Mrs. Thompson looked at the photo and her eyes softened. Yes, she whispered. That's me and my husband, Richard. He passed away many years ago. Lily felt a pang of sadness. You must miss him a lot. Mrs. Thompson nodded. Every day. Lily carefully wiped the dust off the frame and placed it on the clean table. He would be happy to see you smiling again, she said. Mrs. Thompson looked at the little girl with gratitude. She reached out and gently patted Lily's hand. You are very kind, my dear. A warm meal and a warmer heart. Meanwhile, Mrs. Carter and another neighbor, Mr. Johnson, were in the kitchen. They unpacked warm food, freshly baked bread, homemade soup, and some delicious pies. Mrs. Carter brought a plate to Mrs. Thompson and set it in front of her. Eat, dear. You need your strength. Mrs. Thompson hesitated for a moment, then took a bite. The flavors melted in her mouth, and for the first time in a long while, she felt warmth spread through her body. Lily's mother sat beside her. "From now on, we'll bring you meals every day," she said. "You don't have to worry about food anymore." Tears welled up in Mrs. Thompson's eyes again, but this time, they were happy tears. She had spent so many days feeling forgotten, but now she was surrounded by kindness, a promise to stay. After hours of cleaning, cooking, and talking, the house felt different. It wasn't just cleaner, it was full of life again. The once quiet rooms echoed with laughter and warmth. As the evening came, the neighbors began to leave one by one. Each of them promised to return, to check on Mrs. Thompson, to keep her company. Lily was the last to leave. She stood by the door and looked up at Mrs. Thompson. "I'll come by tomorrow, okay?" Mrs. Thompson smiled, a real bright smile. "I would love that." Lily grinned. "Good. Oh, and I'll bring cookies next time." Mrs. Thompson chuckled, something she hadn't done in years. "I'll be waiting." As Lily walked home with her mother, she felt a deep happiness in her heart. She had knocked on Mrs. Thompson's door out of curiosity, but now she had found a friend. And she knew, without a doubt, that Mrs. Thompson would never feel alone again. The next morning, Lily woke up feeling excited. She jumped out of bed and quickly got dressed. Today, she was going to visit Mrs. Thompson again. Downstairs, her mother was already in the kitchen, packing some food. She smiled when she saw Lily. "Ready to go?" Lily nodded eagerly. "Yes, and I made a special card for Mrs. Thompson." She held up a small piece of paper with colorful drawings of hearts and flowers. In big, bold letters, she had written, "You are loved." Her mother's eyes softened. "That's beautiful, sweetheart. She'll love it." They packed some warm soup, fresh bread, and a small apple pie before heading out. As they walked down the street, Lily noticed something different. A few other neighbors were also carrying small baskets of food or blankets. It seemed like word had spread. More people wanted to help Mrs. Thompson. When they arrived, Lily knocked on the door, just like before. But this time, something was different. The door opened quickly, and Mrs. Thompson stood there with a bright smile on her face. "Good morning, dear," she greeted, her voice stronger than before. Lily grinned. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson. You look happy today." Mrs. Thompson chuckled. "That's because I am. For the first time in a long time, I don't feel alone." Lily and her mother stepped inside, and to their surprise, the house looked even better than the day before. The floor was cleaner, the furniture was dusted, and the air smelled fresh. It was clear that Mrs. Thompson had been tidying up. "Did you clean more by yourself?" Lily asked, impressed. Mrs. Thompson nodded proudly. "I did. Yesterday gave me energy. And I had some lovely visitors in the morning. Mrs. Carter brought me breakfast, and Mr. Johnson helped fix my old heater. I feel alive again." Lily felt warmth in her heart. That's amazing. Sharing stories and laughter. They sat down at the little table, and Lily handed Mrs. Thompson the card she had made. The old woman's hands trembled slightly as she took it and read the words. Her eyes filled with tears. "You are loved," she whispered. She pressed the card to her heart and looked at Lily with deep gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you, my dear." Lily smiled. "You don't have to thank me. You're my friend." Mrs. Thompson reached out and held Lily's hand. "And you are mine." They spent the morning talking and laughing. Mrs. Thompson told stories about her younger days, about how she used to love gardening, about the time she and her husband traveled to the seaside, and about the little dog she once had, named Benny. Lily listened with wide eyes, fascinated by every story. She loved learning about Mrs. Thompson's past. "Maybe we can plant some flowers in your garden one day," Lily suggested. Mrs. Thompson's eyes lit up. "I would love that. A promise for the future." Before leaving, Lily and her mother made a promise. "We'll visit you every day," her mother said. "And so will the neighbors. You are part of our family now." Mrs. Thompson wiped her tears, smiling. "I never thought I'd have a family again." Lily hugged her tightly. "You do now." As they walked home, Lily felt lighter than ever. She had knocked on Mrs. Thompson's door just a few days ago, not knowing how much it would change both of their lives. But now she knew for sure this was only the beginning of a beautiful new chapter. The days passed quickly, and Mrs. Thompson's house was no longer a lonely place. Every day, neighbors stopped by with food, warm blankets, or just to chat. Mrs. Carter would bring fresh muffins in the morning, and Mr. Johnson helped fix things around the house. But Lily had something special planned. One morning, she knocked on Mrs. Thompson's door with a big smile on her face. Behind her, her mother carried a small bag, and Mrs. Carter held a basket filled with colorful flower seeds. Mrs. Thompson opened the door, looking surprised. "Oh my, what's all this?" Lily grinned. "We're going to start a garden for you." Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened. "A garden?" Lily nodded excitedly. "You told me you used to love gardening. So we thought, why not bring your garden back to life?" For a moment, Mrs. Thompson said nothing. Then she covered her mouth with her hands, tears forming in her eyes. I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything," Lily said happily. "Just come outside with us." Bringing life back to the garden. The small backyard behind Mrs. Thompson's house was overgrown with weeds. The once beautiful flower beds were now dry and empty, but that didn't stop them. Mrs. Carter knelt down and pulled out the weeds while Lily dug small holes in the soil. Her mother helped by planting the seeds gently into the ground. Mrs. Thompson watched, tears rolling down her cheeks. "I never thought I'd see my garden like this again," she whispered. Lily looked up at her and smiled. "It's not finished yet, but soon it will be full of flowers." After hours of work, the garden was already looking better. They had planted daisies, tulips, and even a small rose bush near the fence. The soil smelled fresh, and the warm sun shone down on their hard work. Mrs. Thompson touched the dirt with her fingers and let out a small laugh. "I forgot how much I love this," she said. Lily handed her a tiny watering can. "Then you can take care of it again." Mrs. Thompson's hands trembled as she took the watering can. She slowly poured water over the freshly planted seeds, her eyes shining with happiness. A place for everyone. Over the next few weeks, the garden became a special place. Neighbors would visit and sit outside with Mrs. Thompson, enjoying the fresh air and the beauty of the flowers growing. Children would run around, laughing, while she watched with a warm smile. Lily loved coming over every day to check on the flowers. She and Mrs. Thompson would sit on a small bench, talking about life, family, and dreams. One afternoon, Lily asked, "Do you still feel lonely, Mrs. Thompson?" Mrs. Thompson shook her head and smiled. "Not anymore, my dear. You and everyone else have filled my heart with love again." Lily beamed. "Good, because we're not going anywhere." Mrs. Thompson gently patted Lily's hand. "And I will never forget the day you knocked on my door. You changed my life, Lily." Lily squeezed her hand. "You changed mine too." As they sat together, watching the flowers sway in the breeze, Lily felt a deep happiness. Mrs. Thompson's house was no longer dark and quiet. It was now a home full of love, laughter, and life. And it all started with a single knock on the door. The weeks turned into months, and Mrs. Thompson's house became the heart of the neighborhood. No longer was it a lonely place with dusty windows and silence. Instead, it was filled with warmth, laughter, and the sweet scent of flowers from the new garden. Lily visited every day, just like she had promised. Sometimes she helped Mrs. Thompson water the plants. Other times, they sat together on the little bench in the garden, watching the flowers bloom. One sunny afternoon, as they sat side by side, Mrs. Thompson sighed happily. "You know, Lily, I used to think my life was over. that I had nothing left to look forward to. Lily turned to her with wide eyes. Really? Mrs. Thompson nodded. But then, one day, a little girl knocked on my door. She smiled at Lily, her eyes filled with love. And everything changed. Lily's heart felt warm. She reached out and held Mrs. Thompson's wrinkled hand. "I'm so happy I knocked," she said softly. Mrs. Thompson squeezed her hand. "So am I, dear. So am I." A special celebration. As Mrs. Thompson grew stronger and happier, the neighbors decided to do something special for her. One morning, Lily and her mother arrived at her house with balloons and decorations. "We have a surprise for you," Lily announced excitedly. Mrs. Thompson looked curious. "A surprise?" Lily nodded. "Come outside." When Mrs. Thompson stepped into her garden, she gasped. The entire neighborhood was there, gathered under a big banner that read, "We love you, Mrs. Thompson." There was a small table filled with food, freshly baked pies, cookies, and sandwiches. A beautiful cake sat in the center with pink and white frosting. Mrs. Thompson covered her mouth in shock. "Is this for me?" Mrs. Carter stepped forward and gave her a big hug. "Of course it's for you, dear. Your family to all of us now." Tears filled Mrs. Thompson's eyes. "I don't know what to say." Lily took her hand. "Just be happy." And so, they celebrated. Mrs. Thompson laughed, ate cake, and told stories from her past. The children played in her garden, running around with joy. The once quiet and lonely house was now full of life, filled with people who cared. As the sun set, Mrs. Thompson sat on her bench, looking around at the people she had grown to love. She felt something she hadn't felt in years. Complete and truly happy. A lesson for everyone. That night, as Lily and her mother walked home, her mother smiled down at her. "You did something very special, Lily." Lily looked up. "What do you mean?" Her mother stopped walking and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You reminded all of us that no one should be forgotten. Sometimes, all it takes is one small act of kindness to change someone's life." Lily thought about that for a moment, then smiled. "I didn't do it alone. Everyone helped." Her mother nodded. "Yes, but you were the first one to knock on her door. And that made all the difference." Lily felt a sense of pride fill her heart. She had only been curious that day when she knocked on Mrs. Thompson's door, but now she couldn't imagine life without her. She looked up at the night sky, the stars twinkling above. "I think Mrs. Thompson saved me too," she whispered. Her mother smiled. "How?" Lily thought for a moment. "She taught me that love never goes away. It just waits for someone to bring it back." As they walked home, Lily felt warm inside, knowing that Mrs. Thompson would never be alone again. And neither would she.